for those of you that have stayed, you were in for a real treat with the last two conversations. We truly have saved some of the best for last. And our next conversation is going to dive deep in a multitude of different directions that we have gone, that we have already covered. But Erin Hardick, my colleague at Zpryme, and Mike Grigsby are coming up on stage to talk about that fostering that sense of creating a village to drive community engagement, community vibrancy. So, Erin, Mike, please join me up on stage and kick this conversation off. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. As Chris mentioned, I'm Erin Hardick. You've heard enough from me already. This is Mike Grigsby, a leader in Cisco's Smart+Connected community practice. And Mike, I was going to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then when I started reading your bio, I figured maybe it would be shorter for you to talk about some of the things you haven't done. Let me just read some of the things that Mike does along with his role at Cisco. He serves as a member of the CompTIA Smart City Advisory Council at Kansas City Tech Council Board of Directors, an advisor for the University Innovation Fellows at William Jewell College. He's a past member of the Kansas City Smart City Advisory Board. And I know you're also a law enforcement and military veteran, so you have done quite a few things, and you came from a background in the public sector as CIO. How have all of these things kind of culminated in this position that you hold today?
So it's either I'm schizophrenic or there's a master plan. Honestly, I was at a conference in New York not that long ago, and it was on the future of work. And an idea came to me, kind of a rounding work on this was, I've done so many different things, and one of the questions to the panel was, what's the perfect career path for young folks to be on? And one of the panelists gave a great talk on what they thought was it was a very scripted path. And at the end, we were going to move on to the next question. I asked the moderator if we could take a moment, and I asked the audience, I said, raise your hand if you have followed a scripted career path. And there wasn't a hand that raised in the room. And you know the idea, there's a lot of things in my background that I've done, but it's been the same work that I've done. I haven't done the same job, but it's been the same work that I've done across. And really, it's just to help distill complex things into simple, understandable concepts, and then help people get out of their own way to move them forward.
So let's get into the conversation that we want to have today, and that's around building this community that fosters innovation. And we have some questions for the audience to think about as Mike and I go through this conversation, and we'll pitch them to you and just really kind of let those settle and think about them as we go through this conversation, and we come to the end and we open it up to audience Q&A. I hope that some of these questions that we ask you at the beginning of the chat maybe give you some ideas for questions to ask Mike at the end. So Mike, before you answer, and I'm going to pitch you the question, then we'll ask them the question, what are some of the challenges cities face when fostering collaboration across a variety of stakeholders and partners? And then for the audience, what are some of the challenges your city faces along these lines? So can you talk about some of the challenges of fostering that collaboration?
And I love that you're asking the audience to do that too, because I'm going to tell you my experience, I'm going to tell you the things that I've done, but it won't really matter unless you're filtering it through the lens of what you're doing or what you're facing, so I'm glad you're asking that. The simple part of how to come together is just to simply come together, and I don't want to understate that, but coming together around an idea. The panel ahead of us was talking about something very similar, and you know, Leo mentioned just getting started. There is a notion here. And I think it's an underlying current sometimes when we go to these conferences and we hear these ideas about what a smart city is or building a smart city, that we have to have this ground up mentality, right? That there has to be something net new that wasn't existing before, that's this envisioned ideal. And I think that's about as far away from reality as we can get. And the truth of the matter is sometimes the easiest place to get started is where you already have momentum. And I'll go back to Kansas City where we started in our smart city footprint. So I was working as the chief information officer for the police department at the time, and the city had moved forward with an initiative to look at smart cities. Well, there was no public safety component of any of the initiative, and I kind of bulldogged my way into the table to make sure that that was something that was being taken care of. Well, the thing that we led with was an existing transportation project. It was a 2.2 mile stretch of streetcar that we were going to do. And we looked at a project that was already existing, that already had momentum, that already had support, already had funding. And then we found ways to raise additional funds to wrap our smart city footprint into it. So we embedded technologies such as smart lighting, smart parking. We looked at public Wi-Fi, digital interactive kiosks, and all of that came on top of a project that was already moving forward. And sometimes the easiest way to hit pay dirt is with something that's already moving forward.
Can you talk a little bit about how you, so at the beginning of these projects, how you even identify who the stakeholders are that need to be involved? And this is another question for the audience. When you're working in your city, how do you guys identify some of these important stakeholders?
Sure. And it's, again, when we talk at the city level, most of these stakeholders are already identified. For example, within a city of a population over 50,000, there's a federal mandate to have a metropolitan planning organization. So the MPO is typically engaged in a lot of transportation initiatives, and some of them have spawned off into other components of that. But the handshakes and agreements already exist within your MPO to bring all the stakeholders to the table. So sometimes bringing the people together, we tend to think that there's a need for permission, and it's more just awareness. It's more information, getting them to the table. If a city decides to, and I work on several projects right now with cities where they're putting in smart lighting. Okay, so many cities have already moved to an LED transition from sodium vapor or something like that into an LED to get some cost reductions. But the idea of creating smart nodes where you can get a further reduction of increase of operational efficiency, there's key players that are already going to be there. Public Works is already going to be there. Public Safety may already be there. The Street Works, if that's something separate, may already be there. So getting, based on the nature of the project, there's kind of an automated convening, if you will, an automated group selection for who the stakeholders are going to be. And then bringing them to the table is really more just a matter of information and sharing what the project is going to be about.
Let's talk about what happens when cities are approached by industry to implement technologies. I think what happens quite often is cities can be very overwhelmed, and maybe they'll pick a technology and they'll say, this has the potential to do a lot of great things, but we don't really know how to get it there. Can you talk about how cities should engage with industry when they are, brought these potential solutions?
All right. Again, going back to my time in Kansas City, I got into the smart city space early on. It was 2010, started understanding, started hearing some rumblings about what this was going on. 2012, we started our entry into that space in Kansas City. And early on, I looked at a lot of different cities. We some of those early components, early cities that were really jumping off with either public Wi-Fi or smart lighting or smart parking or things along those lines. They were being courted by industry with an idea, and effectively, that was kind of like a hammer looking for a nail. Industry had a solution. They were trying to see who was ready for that solution or who at least was interested in that solution. As we have moved and kind of matured, if cities have matured in this space and really understanding what they're needing, there's a better way to approach that from the city standpoint to understand what the anchor use cases are going to be. So if we started out with, let's say again, smart lighting, the use case can't just be a reduction in lighting, right? If you get the reduction in operational costs, what do you do with those funds that you're saving, right? And if there's not a plan for that, then you have a whole other set of issues that you've got to work through. So for cities, identifying what your anchor use cases is essential to determining where you're going to go and how you're going to proceed. And then it allows the city to be in the driver's seat to go look for an industry player or an industry provider who is able to deliver on what you're needing. And beyond that, you get a chance to make sequencing kind of primary and kind of key to your initiative, instead of being at the whim of whatever, or being at the mercy of industry coming up with something new all the time.
A quick follow-up question to that: are you finding that each of these use cases within cities are very specific to individual cities, or are you kind of finding that there are a few use cases that almost every city can define? What does that kind of look like?
No, it is common across almost all cities. We see operational efficiency. We see safety and security. There's digital inclusion and equity, transparency. There's also the economic vitality. How can we create an economic sustainability on this? And then there's also the environmental sustainability on this. So those use cases will bubble to the top, and it may come in different ways, but at the macro view, those are the same use cases that we see.
So you have the stakeholders identified. The project is off the ground. How do you make sure that you keep the project moving forward?
There is the proverbial herding of the cats that has to take place, right? I'm working with a region right now, and I'll share that having this conversation right now mirrors a lot of what's going on with cities out there. And the cities themselves are fast coming to the realization that what we do in one city is going to impact and affect what's happening within the region, right? We have, in a metropolitan region, you may have tens or dozens of cities within a metropolitan region, and those jurisdictional boundaries are identified and held on to only by those representative leadership there. The citizens move in and across and through those boundaries as if they don't exist. So the idea of something happening in one city and the impact to citizens in another is very real and very near. So the idea is not just to try to bring and marshal the people together to say we're in agreement and we're supporting this, but more importantly to inform ahead of a future project to say how can we be in alignment, how can we be in collaboration with this, so that at the end the overall deliverable is a seamless citizen experience across the region.
We've kind of talked broadly from that high-level point of view, but I know that you've worked on some specific projects where you've addressed these challenges and kind of overcome them. Let's talk about those. Can you start by talking about some of the work you've done with the medical district?
So there's one that I'm working on now. I'm not at liberty to say because we're still right in the middle of the project. But what's really interesting on that particular project is they have a bit of autonomy within the city that they're inside of. They don't have the ability to levy taxes, but they do have the ability to pull in improvement district funds and get additional funding along those lines. And what they've done is they've taken the private stakeholders within that district, let them know what the opportunities are, and then found funds in addition to whatever they had from the city or state or federal grant programs or things along those lines. And so the private money can help accelerate and kind of almost initiate some of the heavy lifting on the front side of that. There's creative financing models that can help present a consumption model for services. It could be something as a service. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But one of the things that medical district was really focused in on was the access to services. So from the either disadvantaged populations or people with non-ambulatory people or things along those lines, they were really focused on how do we create the opportunity, one, for access to services, but two, is there a way to further leverage that and further extend that out into a bigger economic impact. And so for them, they have proximity. They're in a large metropolitan city. They have proximity to entertainment districts. So there's a ball field near where they are. There's a lot of large kind of an entertainment district there. So they're trying to find the ways, how do we utilize it in this way during the day, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and then how do we further leverage those same resources, kind of multi-use from that standpoint, on weekends or night times or anything else? So trying to think wide and deep on using those assets and getting the maximum out of them for multi-purposes is huge.
And then let's hear a little bit about some of the work you've done with universities. We're here in San Antonio. There's plenty of universities here: UTSA, St. Mary's, Incarnate Word, Trinity. What has been your experience working with universities?
There's been a recent trend over the last year or 2 years where universities are receiving funds, either private funds or from research foundations that are associated with the universities, to provide greenfield opportunities. One of the universities I'm working with up in Indiana is Purdue University. Purdue received funds from, not only the funds, but they received the acreage from the Purdue Research Foundation, and they've created Purdue Discovery Park District. That was a 400-acre greenfield opportunity that they carved out 200 acres for an aviation innovation hub, and then they took the other 200 acres and they're creating a mixed-use development project. So there's going to be residential, commercial. They're using it. They're also allowing. It was a change, and it was to talk about the creativity side to it. But there was a change in the policies that they are actually allowing single-family residents as a component of that. So they're actually giving that land to, deeding that land to people outside of the college, outside of the foundation. And that's a change for them. That land has been in there for a long time. So some of the other creativity that comes out of that is there's an opportunity to invite experimental services. So they are looking to create an autonomous vehicle circular throughout that. One of the ideas was to completely prohibit combustion engines within that space. And so some of the early architectural renderings showed parking garages on the outside with electric, scooter, autonomous vehicles, and all kinds of things available at no cost to get in and around and through that district.
I did want to ask you about metro planning organizations, but we have about 5 minutes left, which is enough time for one audience question. So does anybody in the audience have a question for Mike?
Howdy. Good afternoon. This is Drew Higgins, CPS Energy. Slightly long question, but I'll start with the fact that there's no spike the football moment in smart cities, right? There's no universally accepted, you're there. And without having a goal, how do you have a plan? To quote like the Cheshire Cat, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, right? And so from the city's perspective, and CPS Energy being a small part of that, how do you build anything without having the idea of where you're going? And if you don't have that, how do you get it?
I love the question, because you're absolutely right. There is no end of the game. It's an infinite game that we're playing. It's not a finite game. There's not known players. There's not known rules. There's not a known end of the game. And so, honestly, I think Leo said it in the panel before, is plant a tree, cut a curb. You have to be almost a zealot about the milestones, because celebrating the milestones shows the momentum and keeps the project going. There is no, we can look at our cities today, and even before we started our smart city conversations, there was no city that was quote unquote done. No city had arrived long before we talked about technology or anything else. Every city was in this constant mode of iteration, growth, evolution, and just a sense of being. So there is no done. A particular project can be done. We can sign off, but the minute you sign off on that, whatever the parameters are, you've got to start thinking about what's next. So I love the question, and inside the question is the answer is just we have to keep going. I get really tickled when I hear people talk about smart cities is the new thing. It's the new thing for cities to do. Cities have been doing smart cities for a long time. People forget, like in 1917, we had the first traffic light in Cleveland, Ohio. That was a smart city at that point. That was a technology introduction that allowed the city to do something very, very different that solved a lot of use cases. And we've been doing this for a long time. This just happens to be a conglomeration of technologies all at one time. And I shared with somebody last night that because of that, we've got a little bit of paralysis because we could see so far out on the horizon as to where we think we can go. We almost get locked up into which foot we're supposed to put forward now. I cannot echo Leo's comments any better. Plant a tree, cut a curb, get a project done. Look for the shovel-ready stuff. That's paramount. Look for the shovel-ready stuff and start there.
We have time for one more question, and I ask that since we are short on time, it's just a question. Does anybody have one more question for Mike?
Thank you. The question is about data, and one challenge that usually is in the Smart Cities project is the acknowledgement that data will be available because of the sensors and all of that, and then we're not sure how to work with data from a governance, from a privacy, from who owns the data and all of that. Can you shed some light on maybe you've seen some challenges like that or a remedy to such a challenge?
I'll give you the simple answer first, is that we will untangle that knot. I don't want to pretend like it's already been untangled, but we will. And there are people in industry, there are people within cities, there are people within research, higher education that are all working towards this. The policy sides, the policies that we have to put out there from a privacy standpoint, from a retention standpoint, from a storage standpoint, there are so many different facets of this. Like I said, it almost produces a little bit of paralysis where we are right now. We have to keep poking the box, and obviously we have to do that with a sense of with a sensitivity towards what I'll call minimizing the blast radius, right? We have to do this where we are doing our dead level best to make sure that we don't have those kinds of privacy issues and concerns. The challenge is that we're going to end up having mistakes. I'm not wishing that, it's just the reality of how we're going to do this. But through those mistakes, we're going to continue to learn, we're going to continue to grow. And there are already incredible policies right now from a data standpoint. City of Seattle, Kate Garman out there, she is doing a wonderful job on putting policy together to help understand where the data mitigations are, where the privacy mitigations are, all of those. A lot of other cities are doing that, but we're going to get there. And it's a challenge right now of just putting one foot in front of the other. It's a great question, though.
Well, that wraps it up for us. I want to first thank the audience for sticking with us. I know it's later in the day, and please join me in thanking Mike for this great chat.